Good morning, girls, and welcome back to today's English language class. Today we study clauses. If you would recall that there are two types of clauses, dependent and independent. Do pay close attention to today's class as we are going to cover a very simple topic. But despite the fact that it is a simple topic, it is very important for you to know. Now that you are quite old, I'm sure that you know the meaning of the word dependent and independent. Many a time, your parents or your teachers in school might have told you that you're old enough to work in an independent manner. Even so, we celebrate Independence Day on 15th of August. So I'm sure that you know the word independent. Independent means able to be on its own. The opposite of independent is dependent. So the two types of clauses are dependent clause and independent clause. Now that you understand the meaning of the words, let's go into it a little deeper. Very simply put, an independent clause or main clause make complete sense by themselves. On the other hand, dependent clauses or subordinate clause as they are called rely or depend on the independent clause to be completely meaningful. So an independent clause or a main clause as it is called can stand alone and make complete sense on its own without any trouble at all. But a dependent clause means that it cannot stand on its own. It is dependent. It relies on the independent clause in order to give it meaning. It is not meaningful on its own. It only gets its meaning when it is used along with an independent clause. So remember, an independent clause can stand on its own. It makes complete sense on its own. But unlike that, the dependent clause is dependent. It relies on the independent clause in order to get its meaning. Do look at the picture I have put in where it is written. Independent clause is a group of words that can stand alone as a sentence. It has both a subject and verb and forms a complete thought. So it makes complete sense on its own. However, with a dependent clause are clauses that cannot stand alone. As the name suggests, they depend on an independent clause in order to form a complete thought. So, as the name suggests, independent clause is independent. It can be alone. Dependent clause is dependent. It relies on an independent clause. So, it cannot be standing alone. It cannot be written alone. It cannot have complete meaning on its own. Do take a look at the following example. The lock that was broken by you has been replaced. So, in this sentence, there is a subject, there is a verb, and that makes the independent clause. So, the lock has been replaced. That is the independent clause. Now, what is that extra information that is given? That is the dependent clause. It is that was broken by you. So, can that was broken by you be used as a sentence on its own? No, it cannot. It is incomplete. It relies on the independent clause to give it meaning. So, this clause that was broken by you, do we know what the subject is? No, we don't know. So it cannot stand alone. It cannot make complete sense on its own. So once we know the independent clause, the dependent clause starts having meaning. So the dependent clause draws its meaning or gets its meaning from the independent clause. Please note that there are three types of dependent clauses which we will take up in today's class. That are adjective clause, adverb clause, and noun clause. So these are the three kinds of clauses. That are three kinds of dependent clauses. Let us first take up the adjective clause. So a clause that acts like an adjective in the sentence and describes a person or object is known as an adjective clause. Let me repeat that for you. A clause that acts like an adjective in the sentence and describes a person or object is known as an adjective clause. Now, I'm sure you know that an adjective is a describing word. It provides information. And as you remember, a clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb combination. So when this clause acts like an adjective, giving information and describing a noun, then it is known as an adjective clause. Look at the slide where it is written. An adjective clause provides information for a noun in another part of the sentence. So, what an adjective clause does is that it provides some information. It gives us some extra information about the noun. Let us take up an example. The girl who has red hair is my cousin. So, in this sentence, who has red hair becomes the adjective clause. Why? That is because we are getting more information about the girl. So, in the statement which I have just given, it describes the girl who is the cousin, and we are getting some additional information about her. Look at the examples which I have inserted in the slide, where the cake that she bought was delicious. So we are getting some extra information about the cake. So the cake was delicious on its own is a good enough sentence. But when we are getting some information, that becomes an adjective clause. We are getting some description about the person or object. In the second sentence, the people who live next door are good neighbors. So the sentence on its own could have been the people are good neighbors. But when we are getting an extra information, extra description, that becomes an adjective clause. So the highlighted portion helps you understand the extra information that is given on the noun. I hope you have understood this very simple type of clause, the adjective clause that describes, that provides information so that it gives extra information just like an adjective does on a normal basis where we know that an adjective is a describing word. An adjective clause describes a noun by answering the question which or what kind of. You can notice the same in the sentences which I have given you. For example, let us take up a sentence. The neighbor that lives next door has returned from his hometown. The painting which was stolen last year has been restored in the museum. So, adjective clauses, you should know, usually begin with words like which, whom, that, whose, where, when. I repeat, adjective clauses usually begin with which, whom, that, whose, where, when. So they are answering the question which or what kind of. So that is something that can help you identify an adjective clause. The adjective clause, you should know, should be placed very close to the noun being described in order that the meaning is very clear. So since an adjective, in this case an adjective clause, is describing the noun, it should be placed very close to the noun so that there is no kind of confusion or ambiguity in the sentence. I repeat that an adjective clause usually begins with which, whom, that, whose, where, and when. A clause that acts like an adverb and describes the action taking place is known as an adverb clause. So I'm sure you know what an adverb is. So a clause that acts like an adverb and describes an action is known as an adverb clause. It tells us how, when, where, why. So an adjective clause, as we know, answers the question which and what. But an adverb clause answers the question how, when, where, why, or even to what extent. For example, she bagged the job because she pursued it with determination. So, in the sentence, because she pursued it with determination tells us why she bagged the job, as it is imparting information about the act of getting a job. It is acting as an adverb clause in the sentence. So, an adverb clause, what it does, it describes the action. It usually begins with words like because, as, if, while, after, unless, until, as soon as, though, since, where. So, examples, as I have given you, if Sam calls, please tell him that I will be late. So, as I have told you, adverb clauses describe an action, and examples are, as I have given you, we played in the garden until. So it is describing the action. The sun set. To help you identify an adverb clause, please note that they usually begin with words like because, as, if, while, after, unless, until, as soon as if, though, since, where. Adverb clauses tell us about the verb in the independent clause. So it tells us about the verb. And here your main focus should just be that how it answers. It tells us how, when, where, why, or to what extent. It begins therefore with a subordinating conjunction. So, an adverb clause is a subordinate clause that modifies a verb, adjective, or another adverb. So, rather than focusing on this, just see a clause, and when it is describing the action that takes place, you can understand that it is an adverb clause. So, here it is describing the action that until the sunset, though she was busy, after he finished his lunch. So these are the actions that have been described. And that is when it begins with words like because, as, if, after, unless, until, as soon as if, though, since, where, you can understand that it is an adverb clause. Now we discuss noun clauses. A clause that acts like a noun is a noun clause. So, a clause that acts like a noun in the sentence and can be considered an object or a person wholly is known as a noun clause. So, just like a clause which acts like an adjective is an adjective clause, here a clause that acts like a noun is very simply a noun clause. The noun clause always answers the question what. Alright, let us look as a very simple example. You should think about what you want to do in life. So, what should you think about? What you want to do in life. Second example, I cannot believe that he is acting so rudely. So, what can you not believe? That he is acting so rudely. So, in a noun clause, all you have to do is make sure that the question what is being answered. This is a very, very, very simple way to identify a noun clause. Noun clauses usually begin with why, how, when, that, if, whether, what. Alright? And you must remember that it answers the question what. This is the best and easiest and simplest way to identify a noun clause.